On a late autumn afternoon, under the steel-gray sky of San Francisco's outskirts, Daniel Harper drove in silence. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, his jaw locked tight. Beside him, Emily sat quietly, her delicate fingers twitching rhythmically, tapping out a pattern only she understood. The German Shepherd Max sat alert in the back seat, his eyes never leaving the girl. The highway led them to an old bridge, long abandoned, overlooking the restless waters of a narrow gorge. It was supposed to be a quiet place, away from the noise of the city, where Daniel could think, or maybe just escape from the mounting pressure of everything collapsing around him. The moment that changed everything came in a blur. Emily had accidentally pressed something on his laptop earlier that morning, wiping out hours of critical data from his latest tech project. It was a project Daniel had poured millions into, hoping to secure a future free from the shadows of the past. The error, innocent, unintentional, had triggered something buried deep inside him. Rage, resentment, memories of Nina, her betrayal, her absence, the way she left when he needed her most. Nina had once been the kind of woman who filled a room with light, a passionate artist with wild auburn curls and a laugh that refused to be contained. She met Daniel during his final year of university, when he was still dreaming in codes and prototypes, and she believed in colors and canvases. Their love had been intense, consuming, and too fragile for the real world. She left him when things got hard, when his first startup collapsed, and frustration made him say words that couldn't be taken back. He turned to Emily, his voice hoarse with fury. "You ruined it, just like she did." In a haze of emotion, he grabbed her small frame and shouted something he couldn't later recall. And then, God help him, he pushed. The weight of years, of silence, of anger, released in a single, irreversible moment. She fell. So did Max. Before Daniel could register what he had done, Max had already leaped after Emily, vanishing into the churning water below. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it cracked everything. The current was merciless, tossing Emily's small body like a rag doll, but Max swam with powerful, deliberate strokes, his instincts sharper than any command he had ever been trained to follow. He caught up to her quickly, grabbing her by the back of her jacket and paddling hard toward the riverbank. They washed ashore near a quiet stretch of forest, miles from the bridge. It was there, not far from the water's edge, that Margaret found them. Margaret hadn't expected to see anyone that morning. Her days were slow, filled with tending to chickens, reading old books, and listening to the wind whistle through the Oregon trees. But something about Max's bark, panicked and persistent, drew her to the river. What she saw made her heart seize, a soaking wet dog guarding a motionless little girl on the muddy shore. She rushed to them, dropping to her knees. Max didn't growl. He didn't move. He just looked into her eyes, almost pleading, as if saying, "She's yours now. Please help her." Emily was breathing, but only just. Her body was cold, lips tinged blue. Margaret scooped her into her arms with the practiced ease of someone who had once raised children of her own. Max followed every step as she carried the girl back to the farmhouse. The next few days passed in a haze of warm blankets, quiet music, and gentle routines. Emily didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply stared into the corners of the room, occasionally mouthing numbers to herself, tapping her fingers in steady rhythms. Margaret had seen trauma before, but this was something deeper. The girl lived in her own world, one built from logic and silence. Yet the way Max never left her side, the way her fingers sought out the beat of his breathing, there was still a connection alive. Margaret didn't know who the girl was, but she knew, somehow, that fate had dropped something important on her doorstep. There was something hauntingly familiar about the child, her auburn hair, the sharp, observant eyes. As Margaret wrapped another blanket around Emily's trembling frame, she couldn't shake the feeling. She had seen that gaze before, years ago, in a different life, in her sister Nina. Margaret was stirring soup when the phone rang. It was late, almost 10 p.m., rare for anyone to call. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered with a hint of worry in her voice. "Nina?" she asked, surprised. Her sister's voice came through the line, low and shaken. "Mags, I've had the dream again." Margaret's heart stilled. "The one with the girl?" Nina took a breath. "Yes, the same girl. Auburn hair, big haunted eyes. She's always near a river. And there's a dog, a German shepherd, every night this week. I can't shake it." Margaret clutched the phone tighter. Her gaze drifted to the other room, where Emily sat curled up on the couch, Max lying protectively at her feet. She hesitated. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly. By the time Nina arrived at the farmhouse the next evening, a light rain had begun to fall. She stepped out of her car, her coat damp from travel, nerves written all over her face. Margaret opened the door before she even knocked. No words were exchanged. The sisters simply embraced, longer than usual, tighter than either expected. And then Margaret stepped aside. Emily was sitting on the rug, organizing buttons by color and size, Max's head resting on her knee. When she looked up, her eyes met Nina's, and the world held its breath. Something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but something ancient, cellular. Nina knelt slowly, not wanting to startle the girl. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she extended one hand, placing a perfectly round button into Nina's palm. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Margaret watched, breath caught in her throat. The girl who hadn't connected with anyone except a dog had just reached for a stranger. And that stranger was her mother. Though no one said it aloud, a door had opened, and something sacred had stepped through. The days that followed blurred into something quiet and surreal. Nina stayed at Margaret's farmhouse longer than she intended, at first out of politeness, then from something deeper she couldn't name. Emily didn't speak, not in full words, but she responded. She sat closer when Nina entered a room. She followed Nina's movements with her eyes. She even allowed Nina to brush her hair, a ritual previously reserved only for Max's calming presence. Max, ever vigilant, watched the pair with almost human understanding. He gave space when needed. He nudged gently when either of them hesitated. It was as if the dog knew exactly what was unfolding, and that it mattered more than anything. Nina spent long hours just watching Emily. Her posture, the subtle ways she tilted her head when thinking, the peculiar precision with which she sorted things. It was all so familiar, not just echoes of herself, but more painfully, of her own mother. There was no logical explanation for what Nina felt. Emily was supposed to be just a lost girl, a stranger, but something about her presence stirred something ancient, deep and maternal within Nina, like a bond that had existed long before introductions and names. Late one evening, while Margaret was preparing tea, Nina sat beside Emily on the floor, quietly organizing seashells into spirals. "Do you know who I am?" she asked gently. Emily didn't answer. She didn't nod or shake her head, but she looked into Nina's eyes, truly looked. And in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not recognition, but resonance, like two frequencies falling into alignment. Nina exhaled slowly, the ache in her chest both painful and comforting. She didn't understand it, not yet, but she knew this little girl mattered to her in a way that defied logic. And somewhere deep inside, Emily felt it too. While something mysterious was quietly blooming between Emily and Nina at the farmhouse, miles away, a very different storm was raging inside Daniel Harper. The moment Emily disappeared beneath the water, something inside Daniel shattered. Not rage, not fear, something deeper, something he didn't even have a name for. He stood frozen on that bridge, the roar of the river swallowing the silence that followed. He waited there for hours, hoping, praying, but neither Emily nor Max surfaced again. That night, Daniel returned home, soaked, haunted, and terrified. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All he could see was her face, the shock, the betrayal in her eyes. It wasn't just what he had done, it was that he had become the kind of man who could do it. For the first few days, Daniel convinced himself that he could fix it. He hired private search teams, divers, even drone operators. He combed every stretch of the river for miles, but he told no one the truth. Not his assistants, not his colleagues, not the authorities. Because if the world knew, everything would collapse. His company, his public image, the life he had built from the ruins of that first heartbreak, it would all be gone. So he told a different story, that Emily was sent to a special retreat, that she needed time away from the chaos of city life. No one questioned him. They never did. But the lie grew heavier with each passing day. 2 weeks turned into a month into 2, and still no news, no body, no evidence, nothing. And that was what kept Daniel going, the nothing. If she had died, someone would have found something, a shoe, a scrap of her jacket, Mac's collar, but there was nothing, and Daniel clung to that absence like a lifeline. Somewhere in him, hope flickered. She's still out there. She has to be. 2 months. That's how long it had been since the river swallowed everything. Daniel had gone from obsession to exhaustion. His apartment, once sleek and pristine, now resembled a war room. Maps, drone photos, handwritten notes, red markers circling coordinates. He wasn't just searching for a child anymore. He was chasing a chance to undo the worst thing he had ever done. And then, one morning, his phone rang. A private investigator he had hired called in, voice trembling. "We may have something. Small town in Oregon. A woman matching your daughter's description was seen with a German shepherd. And another woman." Daniel didn't ask for more. He was already in the car before the call ended. When he arrived at the farmhouse, his heart threatened to burst out of his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe denial, rejection, maybe a corpse. What he saw instead broke him in an entirely different way. Emily was sitting in the grass under the afternoon sun. She was laughing, slightly softly, while sorting smooth river stones into circles. Max lay beside her, ears perked, and next to her, helping arrange the stones, was Nina. His Nina. She looked older, softer, more tired, but unmistakable. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly. Max lifted his head first, letting out a low, curious whine. Then Emily turned. Their eyes met. Her smile faded. She didn't move, just stared. Then Daniel called softly, "Emily." At the sound of her name, she blinked, turned toward him. Then, voice trembling, he said to Nina, "Her name is Emily. She's ours." Nina froze. Her breath caught. The stones in her hand dropped to the ground. She looked at Emily again, this time with different eyes. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Nina took a step back, hand covering her mouth. Tears welled up as memories crashed through her, of a child she gave up, of a life she ran from, of a face too familiar to deny. "Oh my God," she choked out. Emily stood still, watching Nina with quiet curiosity. And then, like something primal awakening, Nina knelt down and reached out, trembling. Emily didn't flinch. Nina choked on a sob, eyes never leaving Emily. "I've seen her," she whispered, "in dreams, in every sleepless night. I thought of her every day, but I was too much of a coward to search." The following weeks unfolded like a slow dawn, quiet, hesitant, but full of promise. Nina stayed. She couldn't leave, not again. Each morning, she and Margaret prepared breakfast while Emily sat at the table, lining up utensils by length. Max, as always, lay beneath her chair, ever her silent guardian. Emily didn't embrace Nina with words or hugs, but healing came in subtler ways. She let Nina braid her hair. She shared her collection of stones and shells. One day, without being asked, she placed her hand over Nina's and whispered, "Stay." Nina cried for an hour after that. Daniel visited often but never imposed. He stayed on the porch, watched from a distance, waited to be invited in. Emily didn't speak to him for days, only acknowledged him through Max, letting the dog walk to him, then watching how he responded. when Daniel knelt and gently whispered Max's name, when he refilled the dog's water without being told, Emily finally looked him in the eye. "You didn't yell," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a shift. Over time, Emily began speaking more. Not just numbers, but thoughts, questions, feelings. She laughed, rarely but truly, and when she smiled, it was like the first bloom after a long winter. Daniel never rushed. He followed her lead, joining her in quiet activities, sorting pebbles, organizing books by height, helping Max through obstacle games they invented in the backyard. One afternoon, Emily asked him directly, "Why did you get angry?" Daniel swallowed. "Because I didn't know how to handle what I was feeling." "And that's not your fault." She nodded slowly, as if calculating the weight of his honesty, then replied, "Next time, breathe." It wasn't just Emily who was healing, it was all of them. Nina, once paralyzed by guilt and grief, was learning how to be present again. She started telling Emily stories about constellations, about silly things from her own childhood, about a woman she used to be and was becoming again. Her voice, once hesitant, grew steadier with each bedtime whisper, and Emily listened. Max watched it all, ever close by, tail thumping gently whenever Emily touched someone first. Step by step, they rebuilt what had been broken, not perfectly, but together. It wasn't an easy decision. For weeks, they avoided discussing it. But the question lingered in every glance, every bedtime story, every moment of quiet joy. Then one afternoon, while walking with Max along the tree-lined road near Margaret's house, Emily looked up at Nina and asked, "Can we go home now?" Nina's breath caught. "Home?" "With him," Emily clarified. "It feels safer now." Daniel had never expected forgiveness. He never asked for it. But when Nina called him and said simply, "She's ready," he didn't speak, just cried. They returned together, slowly. The apartment in the city, once cold and empty, transformed. Daniel gave Emily her own room, one filled with soft lights, walls she could write on, shelves for her stones and patterns. Max had his corner, complete with a custom bed and plenty of space to stretch. Nina stayed in the guest room, and slowly both she and Daniel began to confront the weight of their past. In quiet conversations and long silences, they admitted the selfishness that had driven their choices, Daniel's obsession with success, Nina's fear of unworthiness. Neither excused what they had done, but both began the work of becoming better for Emily, not to win her affection, but to deserve her presence. Life found rhythm. They cooked together, played logic games, took Max on evening walks. Emily still needed her quiet spaces, her structured routines, but she no longer withdrew. She explained, she asked, she touched. On her terms. One evening, Daniel found her sitting on the floor, arranging dominoes in a Fibonacci sequence. He sat nearby, watching. "You know," he said gently, "I never thought I'd get a second chance, not after everything." Emily didn't stop what she was doing. "You didn't," she replied. Daniel swallowed hard. "You made one," she added softly. He smiled, tears prickling his eyes. "With you and Max and your mom, it finally feels like a life I didn't buy, but built." Emily looked up. "Together?" "Yeah," he whispered, "together." And for the first time since the bridge, she reached out and took his hand. 1 year ago, they were 3 broken souls, adrift, ashamed, and alone in different corners of their lives. Now they sat around a dinner table, laughing over burnt pancakes, arguing about whether Max preferred peanut butter or chicken, and the silence that used to hang between them like fog was gone, replaced by warmth, by sound, by belonging. Emily had transformed. Her world of numbers and patterns had opened to something softer, shared glances, spontaneous hugs, late-night whispers to Max about dreams. She began to see the warmth in human connections, something she had long been shielded from. She still measured things, still noticed what others didn't, but now she had something to anchor those observations to. People who stayed. Daniel smiled more now, Not the smile he wore for boardrooms and deals, but the small, quiet one he gave when Emily corrected his logic, or when Nina placed a warm mug beside his hand without a word. Their shared moments, though subtle, spoke volumes of a renewed understanding. And Nina, who once only painted pain, now filled her canvases with hope. She painted sunrises, not because she forgot the darkness, but because now she had something worth waking up for. They didn't speak often about the mistakes. They didn't need to, because every moment they chose to be present. Every time they listened instead of defended, stayed instead of ran. They were writing something new, something stronger. One evening, Emily curled up on the porch swing, Max's head on her lap, watching the sky change colors. "When I used to be alone," she said softly, "numbers were the only thing that stayed." Daniel and Nina sat beside her, quiet. "But now," she added, looking between them, "you stay too." Nina reached for her hand. Daniel did the same. Emily didn't pull away. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was full. The guilt had not disappeared. The sorrow had not been erased. But they had been outweighed by laughter, by truth, by love. They had found what they didn't know they were still searching for, a chance to heal, to forgive, and to become a family once more. And this messy, beautiful, ordinary life was finally, truly, home. Summerville, South Carolina was known for its charm and calm, an old town where life moved slowly, neighbors knew each other by name, and mornings often began with the distant sound of church bells. But on this particular morning, serenity shattered at exactly 6:17 a.m. Without warning, the ground beneath Summerville trembled violently. Buildings cracked, homes crumbled, and chaos swept through the town like a tidal wave. Within minutes, rescue sirens echoed across the streets. Dust filled the air, mixing with cries for help. Among the first responders was Ethan Carter, a seasoned, dedicated rescue officer known for his calm under pressure. By his side, as always, was his loyal partner Rex, a highly trained German shepherd specialized in search and rescue missions. Together, they had faced countless emergencies, but this earthquake was unlike anything Summerville had ever seen. Throughout the day and into the night, Ethan, Rex, and their team worked tirelessly, navigating collapsed structures, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Each life saved was a small victory against the devastation. By early dawn, most of the search had slowed. The town was quiet once again, but not in peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, loss, and destruction. As the last of the emergency teams prepared to leave, believing they had done all they could, neither Ethan nor Rex realized that their most critical mission of the day was still waiting, hidden beneath one final pile of debris, unnoticed by everyone except Rex. The first light of morning cast a pale glow over Summerville's battered streets. Rescue crews were wrapping up, their faces drawn from fatigue, their eyes dulled by the grim toll of the earthquake. The general consensus was clear. Every building had been searched, every call for help answered. Ethan Carter stood near his truck, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. Beside him, Rex sat obediently, though his ears remained perked, eyes scanning the debris-strewn landscape. Like everyone else, Ethan thought they were done, ready to return, regroup, and mourn the losses. But suddenly, Rex stood up. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a slight shift, a twitch in the dog's posture. But then, Rex's body tensed, his nose lifted to the air. Without hesitation, he darted toward a pile of rubble nearby, one they had already combed through hours earlier. "Rex, what is it, boy?" Ethan called, heart rate quickening. Rex began circling a collapsed section of concrete and brick, barking sharply, paws digging frantically at the debris. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by an urgent intensity Ethan had rarely seen. The German shepherd's eyes flicked back at Ethan, filled with something more than instinct, something closer to desperation. Other team members glanced over, shaking their heads, believing there was nothing left to find. But Ethan knew Rex too well. He recognized that look. The same look that had saved lives before. Without wasting another second, Ethan grabbed his gloves, crouched beside Rex, and began to move aside broken slabs of concrete. Dust billowed in the air as the dog's bark echoed through the silent morning. Deep down, Ethan had no idea what they'd find, but one thing was certain. Rex had sensed something everyone else had missed. Piece by piece, Ethan and Rex worked through the rubble. The air grew heavier, filled with dust and tension. Despite hours of exhaustion weighing on his shoulders, Ethan's hands moved faster, driven by the urgency in Rex's behavior. The dog stayed low, nose close to the debris, barking intermittently before pausing, ears flicking forward as if listening intently. Then, a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible. Ethan froze. He leaned closer, straining to hear beyond the shifting stones and distant sirens. It wasn't clear at first, but there it was. A soft, labored gasp. "Hold on," Ethan murmured, his voice low but determined. With renewed focus, he carefully removed the last few bricks, finally revealing a narrow gap beneath the collapsed structure. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness. And that's when he saw them. A young woman, cradling something tightly against her chest, her body limp, her face pale and streaked with dirt, but her arms remained protectively locked around the small bundle. "Ma'am?" Ethan called gently, reaching in. No response. Peering closer, Ethan's breath caught. Nestled in her arms was a tiny baby boy, no more than 6 months old. The child's face was smudged with dust, lips tinged blue, his breathing shallow and fragile. The mother's grip was firm, almost unnaturally still. As though instinct alone had held her son close despite the chaos. Ethan's heart clenched. "Hey, stay with me. You're safe now." He quickly signaled his team. They arrived within moments, stabilizing the debris. Ethan carefully slid into the space, lifting the baby first, feeling how frighteningly light the child was. Lucas, as they'd later learned his name, wasn't crying. He was barely breathing. Rex hovered nearby, whining softly, eyes locked on the child. The woman stirred faintly, her cracked lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. Ethan noticed the blood on her side, the unnatural angle of her arm. She was injured badly, losing strength fast. "Hang on, we've got you," Ethan whispered, motioning for a stretcher. As his team worked swiftly, Ethan felt a strange pull. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face. But there was no time to dwell. Right now, 2 fragile lives depended on him. And Rex never left their side. The ambulance sped through the shattered streets of Somerville, sirens slicing through the early morning stillness. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with urgency. Lucas, the baby boy, lay in a small carrier, an oxygen mask gently fitted over his tiny face. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his skin pale, his body frighteningly limp. Beside him, his mother Sophie barely clung to consciousness. Monitors beeped steadily, an IV drip running as paramedics worked to stabilize her bleeding and fractures. Her face was ghostly, streaked with grime and blood, but she still instinctively turned her head toward her child, even in unconsciousness. At the back of the ambulance, Rex refused to sit still. No one had tried to stop him from climbing in. Ethan wouldn't have allowed it. Rex jumped in without hesitation, immediately planting himself between Sophie and Lucas, as if he belonged nowhere else. His eyes darted anxiously from the baby's fragile frame to Sophie's pale face, ears twitching with every beep of the monitors. Each shallow breath made him lean closer, as though he could steady their lives by sheer force of will. Ethan sat on the bench, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly. His eyes never left Lucas. Every shallow breath the child took felt like a small victory, but also a countdown, reminding Ethan how fragile time was, slipping through their fingers. Every few moments, Rex nudged closer to Lucas's carrier, gently sniffing the air, letting out the faintest whine. It was as though he understood just how precarious this child's life hung in the balance. Ethan reached out, placing a firm hand on Rex's back, steadying both of them. "We're not losing them," Ethan murmured, his voice low, almost a vow. As the hospital's glowing entrance came into view, Rex stood, tail low but determined. He wasn't going anywhere, not until he knew they were safe. The ambulance doors burst open as they reached Somerville General Hospital. Nurses and doctors rushed forward, quickly wheeling Sophie and little Lucas into the emergency ward. Orders were barked, monitors prepped, IV bags hung, all a blur of movement as the trauma team sprang into action. Rex tried to follow. He pushed forward, but hospital staff instinctively hesitated, unsure if they should allow the large, dirt-covered German Shepherd inside. But one glance from Ethan, a subtle nod, and they knew. Rex wasn't just any dog. The emergency room doors swung shut, leaving Ethan and Rex outside in the sterile, too-quiet hallway. Rex immediately sat facing the doors, ears forward, muscles tense, unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his tail. His dark eyes never left the entrance, waiting, alert to every sound. Ethan paced nearby, his boots echoing against the cold tiles. Every few steps he'd glance at Rex, drawn to the same silent vigil. Neither spoke nor moved much, but a shared understanding hung between them, a fierce, silent determination not to let go. Inside, the battle for Sophie and Lucas's lives unfolded. Doctors inserted lines, set up transfusions, adjusted oxygen levels. Lucas's tiny body struggled, his breathing erratic, heart rate dangerously low. A nurse worked frantically to stabilize him, her hands trembling slightly. Sophie's condition was no less dire. She had lost a significant amount of blood, multiple fractures to her ribs and arm, and showed signs of internal injuries. Every second felt like it slipped between life and death. Outside, Rex stood up suddenly, ears flattening back. He paced once, then sat again, eyes locked on the door as though trying to will it open. Ethan noticed, crouched beside him, gently running a hand down his back. "She's strong, Rex," he whispered. "That little guy too. We're gonna see them through." Hours crawled by, every minute dragging heavier than the last. Nurses moved in and out, but their faces remained unreadable. Ethan never left. Rex never left. Occasionally, someone would glance at the dog lying so quietly, so still, but with an intensity in his posture that spoke volumes. Once, when a nurse walked past too quickly, Rex lifted his head sharply, eyes tracking every movement, as if ensuring no harm would come near them. Anyone could see Rex wasn't just waiting, he was protecting, watching over them, just as he had from the start. Finally, as the doors swung open once more, Ethan and Rex stood at attention, holding their breath. The fight wasn't over, but there was still hope. The next few days passed in quiet, tense waiting. Sophie remained in the intensive care unit, her body slowly responding to the treatments. Multiple surgeries stabilized her broken ribs and arm, while transfusions corrected her blood loss. But she remained weak, slipping in and out of consciousness. Little Lucas, though fragile, showed the first signs of strength sooner than expected. His tiny chest rose a bit steadier each day, color returning to his cheeks. Nurses commented on how remarkable it was, how resilient the baby seemed. Almost like something or someone was anchoring him to life. That someone, in part, was Rex. From the moment they were admitted, Rex never left the hospital. Ethan arranged special permission. There was no argument strong enough to separate them. Every day, Rex positioned himself either by Lucas's crib or just outside Sophie's room, his gaze unwavering, his presence constant. Visitors and staff alike began to notice. Some smiled, others whispered softly, marveling at how the large shepherd seemed almost human in his devotion. Whenever Lucas stirred, Rex perked up, his tail giving a faint wag before settling back, eyes gentle and watchful. Ethan, too, was always near. He spent hours sitting quietly by Sophie's bedside, wiping sweat from her brow, reading softly when she stirred. Sometimes he'd cradle Lucas, gently rocking him as the baby fought to regain strength. Every time Lucas opened his eyes, they'd lock onto Rex first, as though reassured by the dog's steady, calming presence. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, Sophie's fingers twitched. Her eyes fluttered open weakly. Disoriented at first, her gaze slowly found Ethan, then shifted to Rex, lying faithfully nearby. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether it was real. Ethan leaned in, offering her a quiet smile. "You're safe now," he murmured. "Both of you." Rex stood, taking a cautious step forward, ears perked, eyes filled with something almost tender. Sophie's lips parted as if to speak, but she didn't need to. Her eyes glistened, and in that shared silence, she understood. Rex had been there the entire time, watching over her and her son like a guardian angel. Word of Sophie and Lucas's miraculous rescue quickly spread through Somerville. In a town where everyone knew one another, news like this didn't stay quiet for long. But it wasn't just the fact that they'd been pulled from the rubble. It was the story of Rex, the loyal shepherd who refused to give up, and the rescue officer who never left their side. Neighbors, friends, even strangers began stopping by the hospital. Some brought baby clothes, others brought food or offered to cover medical bills. A local baker delivered fresh meals daily. A retired nurse donated essentials for Sophie's recovery. It was as though the entire community, shaken by the disaster, had found a glimmer of hope through the survival of this little family. But through it all, Ethan Carter never left. He took shifts at the station only when necessary, but spent every free moment at the hospital. He was there for every update, every check-in, every moment Sophie stirred or Lucas whimpered. His presence was quiet, never demanding, just steady, reliable, always near. Rex mirrored his dedication. The dog shadowed Ethan, but kept his main focus on Sophie and Lucas. Whenever Lucas cried, Rex would rise instantly, tail wagging gently, as if offering reassurance. Nurses smiled at the sight, an unlikely guardian standing watch over the most vulnerable. Sophie, though still recovering, felt it deeply. There was something healing about their constant, silent presence, something safe. And though no words were spoken yet about what might come next, the unspoken bond growing between them all felt undeniable. Weeks passed, and the signs of healing were undeniable. Sophie regained her strength steadily, her wounds mending, her spirit returning. Little Lucas, once frail and unresponsive, now giggled softly, his tiny hands reaching out eagerly, especially when Rex wandered close by. Throughout it all, Ethan remained a quiet, steadfast presence. He never once treated Sophie or Lucas like a burden, never seemed to be fulfilling a duty. His every gesture, bringing meals, adjusting Sophie's pillow, cradling Lucas, was done with a genuine care that went beyond responsibility. Rex stayed as loyal as ever, rarely leaving Lucas's side, often curling protectively near his crib. To the hospital staff, it became clear this was no temporary bond. This little family, brought together by disaster, was slowly becoming whole. One bright afternoon, as Sophie sat up for the first time without assistance, she caught Ethan standing by the window, Rex resting at his feet. She watched as Ethan laughed softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears, and something shifted in her heart. She realized in that moment that the kindness Ethan had shown wasn't fleeting. It wasn't just gratitude or sympathy. It was something much deeper, something she felt mirrored within herself. When Ethan finally turned, their eyes met. No grand words were exchanged. None were needed. Later that month, after Sophie and Lucas were discharged, Ethan stood beside them outside the hospital, Rex at his side. With the town gathering in quiet support, Sophie took Ethan's hand. They didn't speak of what had happened. Instead, Sophie gently squeezed Ethan's hand, her eyes shimmering with unspoken gratitude and something deeper. They spoke of the future, a life built on loyalty, kindness, and the unwavering bond forged not just by tragedy, but by the quiet, steadfast love that had grown between them. In the aftermath of destruction, amidst broken streets and shattered homes, something unexpected blossomed in Somerville. A family, pieced together not by blood, but by loyalty and love. It wasn't just about the rescue. It wasn't only about survival. It was about the unwavering bond of a dog who refused to give up, and a man whose quiet strength carried them all forward. Rex, with his fierce devotion, stood as the thread that tied them together, a guardian who saw past rubble and ruin to something worth saving. For Ethan, Sophie, and little Lucas, the earthquake marked not just an ending, but a beginning, proof that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the darkest moments. And that love, whether from a loyal dog or a steadfast heart, has the power to heal, protect, and change lives forever.